Okay, it's just going live right now, so just giving 2 seconds here.
I see it now says webinar live on YouTube.
Okay, you're good to go.
Right on. Thanks. So thanks everybody for your patience as we get started here. I'm just going to give a brief introduction about the pilot program and what our plan is tonight, and then we'll open it up to a question and answer. So first off, thanks everybody for joining us for our first virtual public engagement session. I'm Sean Olson. I'm the Director of Engineering and Environment at the City of Leduc, as well as the Chair of the Traffic Advisory Committee, or TAC as we call it. It's important to note that the role of TAC is to review transportation safety concerns, both from pedestrians and vehicular traffic, and make recommendations to council. TAC's comprised of representatives from engineering and environment, public services, enforcement services, the RCMP, and council. Again, TAC does not have a decision-making authority. It just makes majority recommendations that then council would go back and consider. So we're here tonight to talk about TAC's proposed pilot to reduce the residential speed limit in the community of Southwark to 40 kilometers an hour. We wanted to give residents the opportunity to ask questions directly of TAC about the proposed pilot. Also, and this will be my first plug of the night on this, there'll be a few of them. Please fill out the survey on our website, including any constructive comments or feedback, as that will be presented to council verbatim in the spring when they make the decision on whether to proceed with the pilot. We appreciate everyone taking the time to come out and share your questions. So a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. This Zoom session is being live streamed on the City of Leduc's website and the YouTube channel. It's also being recorded and will be posted on the City of Leduc's YouTube channel, website, and social media. Attendees will not be on video or audio. You can submit your questions via the Q&A button that you should see at the bottom bar of your Zoom screen. We'll do our best to get to everyone's questions as time allows, including questions that were submitted in advance through that online survey. If we're unable to get to everybody's questions, we're going to compile the submissions and post a full Q&A document on the website after the event, along with recorded video. We ask that you please keep your comments and questions respectful. And if you haven't already done so, please consider, second plug of the night, filling out that online survey, which is going to be open until the end of next week. The survey results, along with the survey submission from tonight's event, will be provided to council for consideration with TAC's final proposal later this spring. So brief introduction. So as I said earlier, I'm Sean Olson, Director of Engineering and Environment with the City of Leduc, as well as the TAC Chair. With us tonight are other members of TAC, Kyle Van Steeneven, Manager, Capital Projects and Development, Cameron Chisholm, Manager of RCMP Administration and Leduc Enforcement Services, Rick Sarita, Director of Leduc Public Services, Mike Peters, General Manager, Infrastructure and Planning. They're here to answer any questions anybody might have about the pilot, and we'll direct questions accordingly. As well, we have members of council tonight. We have Mayor Young, Councillor Glenn Finstad, we have Councillor Beverly Beckett, and Councillor Bill Hamilton. They're here tonight to hear directly from you on questions you might have about the pilot and get a general sense on how you feel based on those questions that are being asked. We want your opinions on the pilot and encourage everyone to fill out the survey, as although I'm sure we'll get a flavor of the opinions tonight, it is a smaller sample size, and we want to make sure we get a representative sample from the community. That's going to be used again by council when we consider whether to implement this pilot. At this point in time, I'd like to open it up to members of our elected officials, if they'd have any words they'd like to share before we get started.
No, we're pretty quiet
All
today.
right. Perfect. So a brief overview before we get into the Q&A. I just want to give a quick overview of what we're actually proposing. So in May this year, TAC is going to propose a bylaw amendment to council to reduce the residential speed limit in the Southwark neighborhood to 40 kilometers an hour. And Sean, do you have a copy of that map you can share with everybody to show what those roads are that we're talking about reducing to 40 kilometers an hour? If you're able to pop that up, I'll just continue on here. So as Leduc continues to grow, We want to ensure our residential roads are as safe as can be for drivers, cyclists, pedestrians, and kids. We know that reducing driving speeds from 50 kilometers an hour to 40 kilometers an hour has been attributed to a 40% increase in pedestrian survival rates. So what we know is going slower is safer, and it results in significantly more people being alive after being in an unfortunate accident as opposed to being hit at 50. We've also heard from many Leduc residents that the current speed of 50 kilometers an hour seems too fast. And that's really after presenting them with data showing actual speeds after we received a speeding concern. So what TAC will quite frequently do when we have speeding concerns is we put up speed awareness signs, and Public Services does a great job of doing that. Those speed awareness signs are often put up in the stealth mode, so it looks like they're not working. And what's actually doing is gathering data of every vehicle that passes by to give us an idea of number of vehicles that pass and what the speeds are. And what we find generally is people are good at obeying the speed limits and they're staying below them. But when people actually sit and see what 50 kilometers an hour looks like, it's too fast. At least it isn't in their minds. We've actually had members of enforcement services sit with residents on their driveway and kind of hidden back just to see what the speeds are, and kind of gone above and beyond and taken shots of cars passing by and looked at the speeds with them, and the resident would say, oh, that's way too fast. And then when they see the actual speed on the gun and it's 50 kilometers an hour, it's, well, no, that's the speed limit. It's just, it's perceived that 50 kilometers an hour is too fast. So that's some of the anecdotal information that's gone into this. That's why we're proposing a trial residential pilot program be put in place. Southwark was chosen specifically because approximately 20% of our annual speed related complaints come out of that area. And it's a cost-effective solution in that location because there's only 2 entry points. So you only have to put signs up in 2 spots. If approved, the pilot would take effect closer to the summer, likely June of 2021. And Sean Hoyne's put up the map here that shows the roads that we're talking about. So you'll notice it doesn't change any alleys. We're talking about changing the regular kind of roads through Southwark. So if approved, the pilot would take effect closer to summer. June 2021, signs would be posted, those 2 signs, and we would take an educational approach to enforcing the new limit. After a couple of years, TAC will review the pilot and determine whether it should be expanded to other residential neighborhoods. The ultimate goal is to significantly increase the safety of our residential roads for our community and our children, lessening injuries and preventing fatalities by only slightly slowing down traffic in residential areas. Also important to note, this is just one part of our overall TAC strategy. We look at rapid flashing solar crossings, and you'll see those for pedestrians throughout the city in high pedestrian areas, as well as it brings attention to those residents. We also look at parking modifications where those have been raised and those concerns have come into TAC. So lowering speed limits is just one part of an overall larger effort by the city. So with that, we'll jump into the Q&A with a reminder the session is being live streamed, recorded, and will be posted on our website. Again, before we get started, we do appreciate everybody's questions, comments, and concerns. We'll do our best to answer all the questions as they come in. A note for everybody, all questions answered tonight along with comments sent in the survey will be presented to council. There will be an online survey still open, and we encourage you to complete that. So I think that's the 4th plug of the night. If you'd like to express your feedback through that avenue for council's consideration. With that, we'll start with a couple questions that came in from the survey before we jump to some of the questions here tonight. So the first question that we received was, what data supports the speed reduction? Is there data that shows traffic accidents are reduced by lower speeds? I'll maybe jump on that one to start with. So we receive about 30 complaints a year, and I think I mentioned that as we did the start here. When people are provided with the data, 50 kilometers an hour is just too fast. It's not so much about the number of vehicles that are exceeding the speed, it's that the perceived 50 kilometers an hour is too fast. And at 50 kilometers an hour, there's a 20% chance of survival if you're hit by a vehicle at 50, whereas at 40 kilometers an hour that jumps up to 60% chance of survival, and that's stats from the WHO. Second question we had here tonight is how many, oh, sorry, and I should ask, does anybody else want to jump in and add anything? If so, please do stop me. Next question, how many traffic accidents has there been in Southwark? Cameron, I don't know if you want to answer that one.
Sure, Sean. Good evening, everyone. We've had 7 injury accidents over the last 5 years. That's from 2016 to 2020. That's based on RCMP data. And in addition to that, we've had 54 property damage collisions. Those are collisions greater than $2,000 from 2019 to 2020. And the reason I only have 2 years worth of data is it becomes purged after 2 years under the RCMP records management system.
Thanks, Cameron. Next question is, are there a lot of pedestrians involved in traffic accidents in Leduc's other residential areas? Cameron, do you want to take that one as well?
Sure. We did a review in 2019, and we actually had 6 vehicle pedestrian collisions across of the entire Leduc. And for Southwark itself, we had that one significant one where the child was struck crossing the street in 2019 and lodged in the wheel well, actually.
Yeah, which wouldn't have gone well at a higher speed, I'm sure.
That's correct.
So we'll jump to the first question here tonight from people in the audience. So the first question I've got here is, why choose 40 kilometers an hour and not 30 kilometers an hour? I might jump on that one here. We've got, there's a few considerations when we look at that. So 30 kilometers an hour is accurate. It would increase the likelihood of surviving in a crash up to 90%, so from 60 to 90%. While that would further increase safety, there are other factors to consider, one of them being regional consistency. So this 40 kilometer an hour pilot that we're proposing has actually already been approved and moving forward in Edmonton, Beaumont, Airdrie, Calgary, St. Albert. I think there might be some other communities I'm missing in there. And when everybody else is trying to pilot it at 40, that regional consistency helps to get people kind of aware of the one set of rules. Also, when you have it set at 40 kilometers an hour, then when you're going into playground zone and school zones where you have more pedestrian traffic, there still is that signal that you need to do something special there, and it draws attention to those zones that they're actually different, and causes people to slow down there too. So that's really the rationale for why 40 kilometers an hour, not looking at something like 30. All right, jumping back to some of the questions from the survey. Do you have any statistics on accidents, near accidents, or speeding tickets that support the pilot? So maybe just a first point, Leduc is a relatively small city. We don't generate a lot of significant data points. And really the recommendation from TAC is around what happens if struck, not how many people get struck. And if struck, we want to make sure that we have better outcomes. And that's really where this comes from. I don't know if anybody wants to add anything to that. Feel free to jump in.
No, we could just say it's a proven intervention to reducing injuries in road users.
And Councillor
Hamilton.
Yeah, so Sean, I know that we and Cameron, we spoke briefly about the child accident in Southwark, and I know that the outcome was positive in that the child survived, but we can't have to hang in there. For anyone who doesn't know the details, I'm just wondering if we can just assure people that that child was, fine in the end, right?
Yes, that's correct. The child was treated at the hospital and released. We were very fortunate in that matter. Had the driver been traveling faster in that situation, I think the end results would have been a lot worse and probably fatal.
Oh, okay, good. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next question we have, here we go. There's another one from the audience. How much will it cost to change the signs within Southwark? Kyle, do you want to answer that one? Because you've been the one doing most of the research into the signage. Oh, you're muted, Kyle. Sorry.
Sorry, there we go. Yeah, I've been working with our public works department, and the signage for Southwark, the signs we'll need to put in will be a little larger and a little bit more expensive for the two we're putting in, because they're basically going to state that the entire neighborhood is 40 unless otherwise posted. So it's a bit more of a custom sign, and those signs are likely in the range of $1,000 to $2,000 per sign. We'll need 2 for the pilot. Should we go with any other kind of program where it's just a standard speed sign, the price obviously drops, but the amount of them we would need would increase substantially.
Thanks, Cal. We have another question from the audience. Are all the property damage collisions related to speed? Cameron, you kind of mentioned the 54 total traffic collisions earlier. I don't know if you guys have data on the cause.
No, we don't have a detailed breakdown on that, but I can say that approximately 50% of our collisions from the review I did in 2019 were related to vehicles rear-ending other vehicles. And that could be indicative of distracted driving or perhaps driving too fast for road conditions and speed.
Thanks, Cameron. Next question coming in from the audience. Why choose Southwark and not other communities? Why not look at it citywide? I might jump on that one. When we're looking at doing this, one of the real benefits of Southwark is there's just 2 entry points. So when we're talking about signage, you only have to come up with the 2 signs, as Kyle mentioned. If we looked at doing it in other communities, most or a lot of other communities have more signs that we'd have to put up, which increases the cost for a pilot. The other option would be to do it citywide, and it's kind of been mixed in the area. So when Edmonton went in and did theirs, they started it as a pilot, and I think they picked 3 communities. Cameron, you're probably the most knowledgeable in the Edmonton program. And when they did their communities, they did it first on a few of them to see how it went before they looked at expanding it citywide. So when we started talking about this, we were modeling our program after the city of Edmonton's. Since that time, there's other communities that have come out and looked at this citywide. So it's a fair question, but the hope would be that we'd start in one community, we'd gauge the public perception, and then see how it goes afterwards, and see if that perception changes and it's more accepted by the general public. Anybody else have anything they want to add to that? Councillor Hamilton.
Sorry, I don't want to captivate the conversation. We're supposed to be listening and learning, but 2 signs seems like, if we're just at the entry points of the neighborhood, it's a big neighborhood. Will there be another component of education for people in the neighborhood, that some other reminders for them that it's a 40-kilometer neighborhood during the test?
That's a great question.
Yeah, that is a great question. Mr. Sarita, you want to answer that one?
Thanks, Sean. It would be our intent to deploy our VRMAC, our digital solar powered digital signboards in the community as well, providing notification on a greater basis to the residents in the neighborhood. But that, including also, and I think Kyle had alluded to it, that we would be installing fairly significant signs as you enter into the neighborhood to indicate to the neighborhood that you are now entering into a 40-kilometer-an-hour speed zone neighborhood. So coupled with the permanent signage and then the VRMAC signage, we hope to get that message out.
We'll also have a website as well, so we'll have that information on the website as well, so it would be prominent on our social media outlets.
And I just add, we do a heavy media blitz on that too, with every avenue we've got, to make sure that people are all aware of what's going on. Cameron, you had your hand up as well?
Yes, we also have the advantage of the detailed pilots study from the city of Edmonton. It's a very complex report, and there's a lot of best practices outlined in that report, which we can follow to during this implementation project or process.
Great. Next question from the audience. Although it helps with survival rate with lower speeds, how many collisions does it decrease altogether? I think that kind of relates to the comment we had earlier. Leduc, especially in one neighborhood, isn't large enough that we're going to generate a ton of accidents. So the hope here is that by slowing the speeds down, when we do have one of those occur, the person leaves the situation far better than they would have if they were hit at a higher speed. So not necessarily knowing the total number of collisions and how that would reduce the speeds. This is about if something does happen, we want to make sure that people have the best possible outcome.
The other thing too on that, Sean, is when we looked at the Vision Zero, so that's Edmonton. So they showed that by reducing the speed, they reduced the number of fatalities since 2015 by 56%, and the number of serious injuries by 30%. So, you know, I don't know, I haven't seen any stats on vehicle damages, but more importantly, we know that it reduces injuries and saves lives.
Thank you, Mary Young. That's great stats. Next question from the audience. Are we going to increase traffic safety for adults and kids? Many kids now play in the middle of the street. So I guess the first thing to note is most of the time when we talk about and see kids out in the streets, we're talking about local roadways, and those local roadways, we already show a high rate of compliance with the speeds on locals. Where we're really going to see the biggest reduction in speeds when we lower this is on the collector roadways. So in Southwark Drive is likely the one where we'd see the largest decrease. We have speed awareness signs that we've put out there to see what the average traveling speed is, and positively, people are following the speed limits. We don't see very many people exceed 50 kilometers an hour, but they're going, you know, high 40s, right around 50. And we think by reducing the speed limit, those same people that are doing their best to follow the speeds now will correspondingly follow that lower speed limit. And that lower reduced speed limit on collectors, if someone crosses the street or jumps out behind a parked car, we'd have that higher chance of survival. Anybody else want to add to that? I guess the short answer to the question is we don't have a plan to do an adult education session with this. We would be trying to bring awareness to the program through social media and through advertising to make sure people are aware of what we're trying to do. Next question. How fast was the driver going that struck the child? From Cameron's earlier example. Cameron, I don't know if you want to handle that one.
Yeah, the statement of the driver was, he said was he's going 30 kilometers an hour, and the witnesses actually corroborated that based on their perception. The vehicle wasn't traveling that fast. We were very fortunate.
Thanks, Cameron. Next question from the audience. How long will you run this pilot in Southwark? That's a subject for debate. I guess right now the tax recommendation is that we trial this for 2 years. That gives us an opportunity to see how perceptions change. Another reason why we really want people to fill out that online survey that'll tell us how people feel about the pilot now, and then when a couple of years is up, if this is successful and it goes ahead, we'd be able then to gauge how that attitude has changed. That said, depending on if it rolls out and how it rolls out, council will be able to direct administration to look at either ending the pilot earlier or accelerating the pilot to increase it or make it permanent or expand it. All those factors would be in play to be able to discuss and see based on data. But I guess in answer to the question, 2 years is the initial pilot that we've been talking about. Next question. Does this enable any design changes calming, such as curb extensions, lower turn radius, or raised crossings in future phases? That's a great question. So we recently sat in on some traffic calming webinars and are trying to kind of learn more about some of the traffic calming measures that are out there. I think it's safe to say that if this is successful and goes in, one of the things that helps maintain speeds is changes in geometry. Things like curb extensions are definitely things we could consider in the future. That said, right now what we're seeing is a high rate of compliance with the posted speed limit. So there's no reason to think that when we do the change that people wouldn't follow suit and continue to drive the speed limit. We'll be able to gauge that with speed awareness boards and see if there's actually a need. If by posting it all by itself, that actually has people driving slower and driving the right speed limit, there may not be a need to make some of those geometry changes. A lot of that'll depend on kind of what actually happens out there after the pilot's put in place. Next question. For those 7 incidents, were there any common factors or locations between them? Cameron, I don't know if you can answer that one.
No, we don't have that information.
Thank you. Next question is, isn't distracted driving more of a problem than speed? How many accidents are caused by distracted driving compared to speed? That's a great question. I don't know that that's a question that we would have the data for. Cameron, I don't know if you've got that from the enforcement side.
No, I don't. And quite often people won't admit to the fact that they were distracted when they're driving because it carries a penalty.
The next question is, if there's no baseline data around number of collisions within the area, how will we know whether this pilot is successful? And I think it's really important to point out that the measure of success is kind of known. We know that if you get hit at a lower speed, you're more likely to survive. So that's not the data that we're necessarily looking for. That's been proven in other cities. We have that data from the city of Edmonton that Mary Young had referenced earlier that indicates that by putting this in, you're more likely to reduce those collisions. When we're talking about collecting baseline, we're really talking about the public perception and seeing how that changes over time once this pilot's in place. Next question from the audience, the speed notification signage board, currently located across the street from the commercial property, was once located further west on Southwark Drive. What was the reason for relocating the sign to a location where drivers are naturally forced to slow down due to approaching intersection 2A? And is it possible this was skewed the data received from the speed notification signage board? I think, Rick, I might turn this one over to you. We do get a lot of these questions at TAC. And people ask us, hey, we see speeding in this area or in this area, and we'll move those signs around, and Public Services does a fantastic job of doing that to try and keep up with where the concerns and complaints come in so that we can kind of see how things change over time. I don't know if you remember when we moved that one or why, or but I don't think we've had data in any of these locations to suggest we had speeding issues.
I'll just maybe Councillor Finstad has put his hand up. So.
The only comment I was going to make was by moving the signs around, people don't get used to them. Like, for example, if the sign's in the same place for 3 or 4 months, it's no longer effective because you're so used to it, you expect it to be there. And by relocating the signs, you change people's habits, you change what they're looking at, what they're perceiving as they're driving. And that has a big impact on speed alone, because if you get used to a certain thing, you take the same route to work every day, you almost do it out of habit versus paying attention, and moving things around like that just forces us to have a look at things in a little different way, and keeps us more alert.
Yes, and if I could add, thank you, Councillor. If I could add as well, Public Services does respond often, as you indicated, Sean, to requests by the public to move. The signs that they may perceive either are in a better visual eyesight by where we would move them as opposed to where they were previously at. I can tell you the other factor that does come, not always, but often comes into play. Our signs are solar powered. So there is a solar panel that charges the batteries that keeps them operating. We've experienced this issue on one of the 2 speed awareness signs that we have on 50th Avenue, the downtown area. Where it was located, it was being shielded by trees and other obstructions, I'll call it, and was unable to continually charge the battery. So in order to remedy that concern, we had to end up moving the sign slightly so it had a better field of vision to the sun and to basically daylight in order to keep it charged. So there's various reasons, like I say, requests by the citizens, and obviously charging, and a plethora of other reasons.
Thanks, Rick. Next question that came in from the audience asking, where can I find the online survey that you mentioned? So for anyone looking, it's at leduc.ca/speed reduction-pilot. I found it by just Googling Leduc, Southwark, and speed, and the website pops up. Next question from the audience. Having a pilot for 2 years seems like a long time. Will you consider a shorter period and make a decision? I think that's a fair question. So 2 years is kind of, like I said, modeled after what the city of Edmonton did. We're not opposed, or at least administration is responsible to council. Ultimately, if that was a decision that council wanted to shorten the pilot and have us look at shortening it up, that's 100% within the purview. When you're making these recommendations, you have to come forward with a recommended trial length, and again, that's kind of based off what the city of Edmonton did. With a lot of other communities going to 40, maybe there would be an opportunity to look at shortening the pilot. I don't know if anybody else wants to add to that. Mary Young.
Yeah, and I think that would be based on feedback from the public. You know, if we get lots of positive feedback, there's no reason why we couldn't shorten the length. It's right now, we're going to pay attention, see what happens, and make a decision based on the information we get back.
Thanks, Mary Young. The next question that's come in says, with Southwark not quite half developed, has there ever been a discussion with Tammany regarding the width of the roadways? I've only ever had a couple close calls, and it's always been in the narrower roadways from kids coming out between the parked vehicles. The narrower roads don't give any buffer space if anyone does step out. This would also help during snow clearing. So that's a really good question, and Kyle, feel free to jump in on this one, but we just took our engineering standards forward to be updated. The engineering standards specify roadway widths, and they're consistent across the city. Generally, when you look at the roadway widths in Southwark or any new neighborhood in the city and you compare them regionally, our roads are about as wide as anybody's. In fact, if you go into some of the newer areas in the city of Edmonton, you'll find their roadways to be quite a bit narrower. We've done that to try to make driving as easy as possible. And there's a trade-off with developers. So the more wide you make roadways, the more expensive they are. And there's ultimately a balance between how wide you want to make your roads and the cost to developers. There's also in play there, the wider you make the roads, the more enticing it is to drive faster because it feels like you're on a freeway if you ultimately make it wide enough. So there is a balance there to try and find that right fit between roadway width, being wide enough for two-way traffic unobstructed, and being able to have fire trucks be able to park and have their outriggers out there and be able to put out a fire, with kind of the cost of making them bigger and some of the negative implications around speed if you make them wider than necessary. Kyle, do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, not really. I think you've covered most of it. We do have some of the widest local roads in the region now with our standards, and it's exactly for that reason. Is we know that on-street parking is becoming a bigger thing. There's more vehicles per household nowadays, things like that. And so we are one of council's mandates when we went to our standards was to keep them larger and keep them keep that feel of Leduc as best as we could, as opposed to the city of Edmonton where they actually make the road small enough that it's only one-way traffic. So yeah, I don't have much more to add to that.
Councillor Finstead.
Yeah, thank you. I know over the years, I've been approached by many developers saying, how come your roads are wider than everybody else in the region? I said, we made that decision consciously and purposely in order to, so that, as discussed, emergency vehicles go down, but also Leduc has a high percentage of work trucks, heavier trucks. And some of the narrow streets in Edmonton, if you get two 1-ton dualies parked across from each other with big mirrors, it's almost impossible for a single vehicle to go down the middle of the road, never mind have vehicles pass each other. So from that's one area that we as Leduc are proud to be different than the rest of the region, is having roads that are actually travelable, if that's a word, and with less likely of interaction with other vehicles, either parked or oncoming.
Councillor Beckett.
Thank you, Sean. So I'm going to reference the the subdivision of Summerside in South Edmonton. And so I had a grandson that had a condo there. And in the wintertime, when that snow piles up in the center of the street, and so help me, and especially if it's glare ice, it really is difficult to try to stay on the center of that road because the parked cars are so close to where the driving is happening. And so I think that the city of Leduc really needs to be proud and in terms of how we're trying to prevent that. And so I think that's just something that we need to keep into consideration when we are looking at the engineering standards, and just make sure that we continue to have the streets as wide as we possibly can.
Thank you, Councillor Beck. All right, moving on to the next question here. Has an amount of extra time spent driving in the neighborhood been determined at 40 versus 50? It's a really good question, and we thought about that one prior to. Cameron actually had members of enforcement services go out and do some driving. And Cameron, I don't know if you want to speak to that.
Sure. We did 2 different tests, and we went from Father Leduc to Southwark and Southwark. Repeated that 3 times, and then did at 50 kilometers an hour, and then did the same trip at 40 kilometers an hour. And there was a 19-second difference in the travel time between traveling at 50K versus traveling at 40K an hour. We also repeated the same point A to point B test again under the same criteria, and we went from the 200 block of Sturts Bend to Southwark and Southwark, and there was an 18-second difference. So not really much time when you look at the possibility of saving somebody's life.
Thanks, Cameron. Mary Young.
There we go. Got to find the unmute button. Yeah, the other thing too is when you take a look at the average speeds in the Southwark neighborhood, we're closer to 40 than we are to 50, and so really it's not going to be that big of a change. And so I don't think that the time traveling from point A to point B is going to be very much impacted. And so, you know, I think that actually by switching this neighborhood to 40, we're going to be reflecting more what the actual speeds are in there.
Absolutely. And if I can just build on that point a little bit, Rick, you had public services pull our speed awareness signs in Southwark in 4 different locations. One of which being the one we talked about earlier at Southwark and Southwark, that intersection, but also another one closer to the school, not within the school zone, but along that same road. And then there's 2 more in the park spaces. And we find a very high rate of compliance where we're hovering around 40 on the one by the school. We actually have, I think, 30 kilometers an hour is about the average in the park zone, which is right where you want to have it because it is a playground zone. And then the one closer at Southwark and Southwark's right around 50. I don't know, Rick, if you want to add anything to that or if those are spot on or close.
Actually, you're a great point there, Sean. Just reviewing, I mean, I have several speed reports in front of me that I'm looking at here, and I can tell you that I'm looking at speed average, and they're typically 1-month reports, and I'm looking at 33 as an average, 31, 38. I'm looking at 33 again, and 32. A lot of 32, 33. Here's one for 37. So these are monthly averages. So really positive data, I must say. Positive. Thank you.
Just for anyone that isn't aware, 2 of those speed signs are located in school zones. So seeing speeds right in that low 30s is really positive. That's indicative of what we want to see in a 30 kilometer an hour zone. Next question from the audience. People are placing quote unquote kids playing here signs on the road to allow their children to play on the street. Would this not be a greater concern than speed? This is happening in several Leduc neighborhoods. I'm not sure why that would be a greater concern than speed. Obviously, it's not something that the city of Leduc goes and places. Rick, I don't know, or Cameron, if you guys have any comments to add to that.
The only comment that I guess I would add is that we do see them placed in different neighborhoods of the city, but typically, and it's an unfortunate comment, but often I've seen them where they are deployed where in cul-de-sacs and areas like that where kids are playing on the street. So that is something that we've noticed. But I will mention that the City of Leduc Public Services does have a program with our local schools that we do provide signage for the center of the pedestrian crossing in many of the school zones that identify that school zone a little bit more visually to the motoring public. As they're entering into that school zone, there's a pedestrian crossing, and there will be the sign that indicates that this in fact is a pedestrian crossing, and be careful. So those that program that we implemented several years ago with the local school boards has been very well received.
Yeah, I think maybe part of the bottom line with it too is Leduc's got a fairly young demographic. There's a lot of kids. For whatever reason, if it's a high pedestrian traffic location and there's people in the road, wherever they're there, the more things we can do to alert the traveling public so that we don't have serious incidents is a good thing. That's the same reason we put out the rapid flashers at crosswalks, so that in high pedestrian locations, we alert people so they slow down and they know someone's crossing there. It's the same reason we look at no parking signs and extending some of those no parking zones in areas where there's blind corners. At the end of the day, regardless of the reason of why someone's in the street, if someone's there, we want to try and avoid having a serious incident.
Right. And if I can add, Sean, City of Leduc was one of the first cities or municipalities in the capital region that I'm aware of that deployed the flashing lights to identify where the school zones are, the flashing beacons. And they're very well received as well. And it's sort of a reminder, gentle reminder to the public as they're entering into a school zone that if the school zone is active at the time, that we have the warning beacons that are also identifying that as well. That program has been extremely successful.
Next question from the audience here, as is the case with many drivers regarding speed on green cameras in Edmonton, do these highly visible speed notification signage boards cause drivers to temporarily slow down? To properly gauge the effectiveness of the pilot program, would TAC consider less obvious data trackers? So I think here it's really important to note when we're talking about gauging the effectiveness, yes, one part of it is the speeds. We do deploy those quite often in stealth mode, and what that means is we'll move them around and we'll put them in places and we leave them off. So to the traveling public, oftentimes they don't even know they're there, or if they are there and know they're there, they don't think they're working, because we actually get quite a few calls and complaints saying, hey, your equipment's not working. You got to get out and do something about it. And that's where we'll quite often say, no, it's working just fine. And we're trying to gather good data by not having those speeds. So yes, I guess in answer to your question, they do work. They do slow people down when they see the flashing sign. It's a really effective tool in our toolbox to get people to drive the posted speed limit. But we do sometimes deploy them in stealth mode so that we can get that good data on how fast people are traveling without them in place.
And Sean, if I can also add to that, just so that it's clear for the public or the general public, these speed awareness signs that we have, or driver feedback signs, whatever you'd like to call them, do not have any type of enforcement capability. Because we do get that question periodically, is it really a photo radar unit? Can it in essence take violation tickets or pictures of violating vehicles, that type of thing? Absolutely not. It only tracks, matter of fact, it'll only provide data for the vehicle that's approaching the sign or in the direction of travel of the sign. So no, it cannot take photographs. It's not a tool for enforcement. It's the best way I can describe it is a driver feedback sign. It provides feedback to the driver as they're traveling. They may They may have other things on their mind. They're not necessarily looking down at their speedometer on their vehicle, but it provides that visual feedback and immediately, oh, wow, I'm going too fast. And then they'll immediately slow down.
If I can just add on those as well, I think it's worthwhile pointing out, and this is kind of council's leadership on getting a lot of these things in place. Those speed awareness signs have a lot of benefits from the city from a cost-effective investment standpoint. They gather not only speed data, they act as that speed deterrent when they're on and flashing, but they also give us really good data on the engineering side when we look at designing roadways and figuring out traffic volumes. They can be quickly put up and gauge how many vehicles are traveling at what points in the day, at what times. From an enforcement side, if there is a significant issue that something's needed, they can then tell them, okay, you know what, we have people speeding at this given time. And then that information then can help enforcement services decide when they need to do some education. So I think there's a lot of really positive things with those speed awareness signs. They don't directly enforce, as Rick said, anything, but they provide really, really good information to the city at a cost-effective rate, and they act as a good a notification system to have that flashing light to tell people, hey, this is how fast you're actually going, and it causes people to slow down. So just a really, really good investment. The next item down, what will enforcement look like, and can residents report cars that go over the new speed limit? Cameron, are you okay handling this one? This is really, I think,
I'll speak to it. I think it's very important to note this is a traffic safety initiative. It's about reducing injuries to road users. It is not about traffic revenue. That needs to be made perfectly clear. It's about traffic safety. And just like in any other enforcement matter, compliance through education is what we have as a priority. If there's an egregious issue of somebody speeding well above the posted speed limit, we'll deal with that on a one-on-one basis. But there will be a phase in, just like with any traffic change, whether it's new lights, new stop signs, and so on. There's a phase in period. It's education first before we start looking at enforcement. So again, this is a traffic safety initiative we're looking at. Revenue doesn't come into the picture. We're trying to save lives.
Thanks, Cameron. It might actually even be worthwhile, if you don't mind, just mentioning about the photo radar, because that question comes up quite often. And I think you'd mentioned before that there's not even an option to increase the photo radar. Like it wouldn't even cross our mind.
That's correct. Right now, there's a provincial freeze on the addition of any new photo radar equipment or adding additional zones. In the Southwark area, our only deployment there is in the vulnerable road user area, and that's a playground. So we wouldn't be looking at additional photo radar on the streets in Southwark, other than what we have right now, and that's in the playground zones.
Thanks, Cameron. Marianne?
Thanks, Sean. And I think the other thing we're looking at is things like speed tables and maybe even raising intersections and that. And so I think that going forward that we're going to take a look at our neighborhoods and see what we can do. Enforcement to me is always one of the last options as far as traffic calming. And I think that there's lots of other things that we can do that will just naturally slow down traffic in residential areas. So, this is just a first step, and we're going to take a real look at going forward at other things that we can do.
Thanks. Great point. Next on the list from the public here tonight, if most drivers are already traveling below 40 kilometers an hour, what is the value in implementing this program? So when we say most are going under 40, that's really roadway specific. So you'll see on a lot of collector roads that people are already, on local roads, people are going under 40 kilometers an hour. Where we're seeing people go the 50 kilometers an hour is on collectors. So that's really actually the reason why you would want to do this community-wide rather than just picking certain roadways, in addition to it being more costly. By having it, if you did specific roads, by doing an entire community, you're taking those individual roads where the average person's actually traveling closer to 50 and you're dropping it down to 40. So if someone were to get hit in those locations, it's a significant change in the outcome. Next question is, I hope the city won't do things like Edmonton, that there were 30 kilometers an hour, 50 kilometers an hour, 30 kilometers an hour, back to 50 kilometers an hour, all on the same road in less than a 10-second drive. That would be ridiculous, and you may as well make it 30 kilometers an hour throughout. Hear you loud and clear. I think the opinion reads through on that. Our intent would be to only drop the speeds below 40 in areas where we want to cause awareness to it. So when you look at Southwark, there's a park on, I think it's Southwark Drive, and another one at the junior high. And those are the only two areas I think right now where we have decreased speeds. Everywhere else, it's pretty consistent. So when we change it in the community, one of the benefits of this is that you post at the entrance to the community, unless otherwise posted, everything is 40. And so then you have that consistency. You don't have a whole bunch of changing speeds. It's more costly for the city too to have changing speeds all over the place. We want to keep it consistent as much as possible. The next question, will you consider pedestrian only streets in Leduc? That's a great question, and is something that's kind of outside the scope of this. That's really a policy question and would be something more for our planners. I don't know that that's something that we can necessarily answer here tonight. It would have to be streets that wouldn't have significant detrimental impacts on the traffic network. And usually those pedestrian only streets are in areas where there's high commerce, and you see them in a lot of places in where you've got lots of shopping and stuff like that, and you'll close one of the streets to make it a heavy pedestrian area. Definitely not the case in Southwark, so not part of this pilot, but something that would be probably for another table. The next question, will the city consider doing some education campaign? The weather's getting warmer, there may be more pedestrians and cyclists on the road. That's a great question and something that comes up in TAC every year. We do a kind of a blitz in the spring, especially with motorbikes, both ways. One, to let people know bikes are back on the roads, to look for them. Another one to remind our friends on motorbikes that they're also in residential communities, and exciting as it is to get back on the bike, we don't want people revving up and blown by residential houses and getting those same noise complaints that we see quite a bit. So there's a lot of advantages to getting the message out there and educating people as the weather turns and people get back out and cyclists are out and people are walking more and everything else. So yes, I guess the answer is we do have an educational campaign that happens every spring. I don't know if anybody else from TAC wants to add to that, because that comes up every year.
Enforcement Services actually has a calendar that they follow that goes into the various safety components. For example, in September, we focus on schools. We have bike safety. Each month has a different theme, and that's available actually on the City of Leduc website.
Rick. Oh, you're muted, Rick.
I apologize for that. I hit it, but I guess I hit it too quick. I just wanted to add that what we try to endeavor to do within public services is with our digital VeerMac signs that I've earlier mentioned. We have them scattered throughout the community. And we often, if we don't have a message at the time that's required for construction work or something like that, we'll typically put generalized traffic safety messages on those signs. So if it's springtime and we're concerned about, or we want to get the message out, the motorcyclists are now on the road, be aware. And, especially as an avid motorcyclist myself, I like people to, be aware that if I'm out there to be aware of that. So we do put various messages, whether it be messages prior to school, getting back in, let's say over the summer break, be aware of children going back to school, and various other messages. I won't go into them all, but that's also another very, very good tool.
Thanks, Rick. Next question, we're starting to get towards the end, so we'll wrap up here shortly. If you have other questions, please do try to get them as quickly as possible. We'll try to get to them, but hear from the public. How high is stop sign pedestrian crossing compliance compared with speeding? Are there plans to address those with this change? Cameron, I don't know if you guys have stats on that from the enforcement side on stop sign compliance.
No, I don't have that handy right now.
Okay, thanks. Not seeing any other questions from the audience at this point in time. We'll go to a couple more of them from the online survey that came in advance. Questions about the costs or enforcement theme that we received. Well, we already talked about the photo radar, so maybe I'll skip past that one, and that it wouldn't be the method here. Has consideration been given to putting pedestrian lights at crosswalks instead? So TAC currently installs solar powered flashing lights at many uncontrolled crossings in the city. It's part of our overall strategy to make the streets safer. Just a note for anyone that does want to request that TAC look at that or parking changes, you can call 780-980-7107. That's the number to call to get your question added to Traffic Advisory Committee's review or have it looked at. Next question here is, have four-way stops been considered as a way to slow down traffic instead? So four-way stops, they do delay the travel times for vehicular traffic far more than lowering the speed limits, and traffic flow is really important. You're not going to want to have a collector stopping at every local roadway. It'll take a lot longer to get out of a neighborhood and really impedes the flow of traffic. There are best practices in terms of where to place those stop signs, and so you try to make sure that your higher classification roadway has the free flow. And Cameron mentioned before about the speed test when we actually looked at what this change in speed would do throughout the community in terms of total travel time, and it was a 19-second change between the farthest point away and Southwark Drive. With that, we're getting to 7 o'clock here, so I'm going to move to the wrap up. So just want to thank everyone who attended tonight's event. We appreciate your time, questions, and feedback, and I hope the information that we provided was helpful. Just a reminder, and I promise this will be my last plug of the night, that we hope everyone fills out the online survey. That's really the best way to make sure we know your opinion and have your comments sent directly onto council. For anyone that wants to ask additional questions or provide thoughts, we're happy to answer them. We'll use those submissions to create a Q&A document, which is going to be posted onto the website along with this recorded session. And the final survey results, as well as a summary of submissions from tonight, including the ones we weren't able to get to, although we did get to all of them that were submitted, will be provided to council for consideration with TAC's final proposal later this spring. With that, if anybody else has any comments, open the floor to our panel. Thanks everyone for taking the time. I really appreciate it. It's been good to be able to get the message out there of what we're trying to do.
Great job.
Take care, everybody.